So that music I can hear, Daniel, that's at your end?
That's our introduction countdown music, in case you want to do the dancing a little bit beforehand.
Well, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. My name is James Walker. I'm the co-founder of the movement, along with Bill Cluck, which I'll introduce in a minute. And we are a monthly gathering of believers and non-believers, atheists, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. I am a Christian. I am the president of Watchman Fellowship, an evangelical apologetics ministry focusing primarily on evangelism of new religious movements and alternative faiths. Our other co-founder, Bill Cluck, is a former Christian, now atheist. And our guest today is Graham Oppy. Graham Oppy is our guest author. He's an Australian philosopher whose main area of research is philosophy of religion. He currently holds the post of professor of philosophy and associate dean of research at Monash University. He serves on the editorial boards of Philo, Philosopher's Compass, Religious Studies, and Sophia. He was elected fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities in 2009. And we're going to be talking about his 2018 book, Atheism, the Basics. Welcome back to the Atheist and Christian Book Club, Graham.
Thanks for inviting me back.
Well, I'm excited about this. I've got some questions I want to ask first. Let me kind of lay some ground rules down. We are a respectful dialogue, and I just want to commend everyone. We get into some very controversial issues, and we do it with passion, but it's always respectful, and from both sides of the aisle on that, atheists and Christians. I did want to say we want to extend that that respect and to our text as well. I have noticed that there has been some texting that would be a little less than civil. So this goes for the whole book club. Whether you're atheist or a Christian, we ask you to not hold back on the hard, tough questions, but to do so with respect, and we will certainly appreciate that. I'm going to introduce the other co-founder to you, Bill, in just a moment, and we're going to both have some initial questions for you, Graham. And then for our club members, what we're going to ask you to do is simply text your question, and Daniel Ray will be able to take that. And then we will call you to talk with Graham, to ask your question. We'll ask you to unmute your microphone. So just put it in the text if you have a question. Of course, you're welcome just to be lurking in the background there. You don't have to turn on your camera or say anything, but if you want to say something, have some insights or ask some questions, we do want to give you an opportunity to do that. Graham, I wanted to just get a question to first before I turn it over to Bill. This is something that's come up quite a bit in our book club. We've been doing this over 5 years, almost 6 years now. And every couple of months, we do have a push towards this idea that atheism should be the default position, and that that there's no need to make a positive case for atheism, since atheism doesn't posit any type of a truth claim. It's just the absence of data or the absence of belief. Therefore, it's the burden of proof all falls on the Christians. You have those two ideas, the default position, but also that the theist has the burden of proof, and there's no burden of proof at all. And I know you address that in the book, but for those who may not have had time to read the whole book, could you kind of address that for us again? At why is atheism not the default position that does not need to be defended?
Okay, so atheism is just the claim that there aren't any gods. It's not a worldview. The worldview that I espouse is sort of complicated, but part of it is naturalism about causal reality. Now, any worldview, when worldviews come into conflict, as they do, there's no presumption in favour of one against another. So it's not like naturalism is the default position, or my naturalistic worldview is the default position. And it's not like, say, some particular Christian worldview is the default position either. There's no such thing as a burden of proof that falls more heavily on one worldview than it falls on another. And it's worth remembering from the beginning that atheism all alone is not a worldview. Right. So is that enough by way of answer to your
Yeah, I think
question?
so. I think so. It's just, again, it's something that a lot of the theists will argue that it's not by the default position as well. And but it's good to have somebody from the other side of the aisle also agree with that particular thing. So I just wanted that to kind of get on the record a little bit. So our other co-founder is Bill Cluck. Bill Cluck's a former Christian, now atheist, and is co-founder with me. So Bill, do you have a question for Graham or some questions?
Yeah, I do. Graham, are you familiar with this number? Alpha equals 1/137.
The fine structure constant?
Yes, great. Wolfgang Pauli said the first thing he's going to ask the devil when he sees him is, what's up with this fine structure constant? Just an amazing number, and it appears in physics all the time. It's dimensionless. It's not like, we can measure it in speed like the speed of light or the mass of an electron or whatever, but it is just a remarkable number. And here's the thing, if that number was greater, then you would have the electrons too close to the nucleus and you wouldn't get chemical bonding. If the number was less, then you would have atoms that are unstable. So if this number was 4% greater, then you wouldn't have carbons in the nucleus of stars forming. We wouldn't have carbon and oxygen, which means we wouldn't have life. So it's an incredibly important number. And Richard Feynman said that every physicist should put this on their wall and wear it. Are you worried?
No.
Okay. But it's not only that. You have these gravitational constants, 10 to the 60th. You have the strong nuclear force that holds the protons together when in the nucleus. And these things have to be just right on, or as what's his name said the other day, Luke, in our club, that you just get helium or hydrogen floating around the universe. You do not even get atoms unless these constants are really fine-tuned. So what do you think? And a lot of atheists have said the fine-tuning argument is the biggest problem for us. What do you think?
So, I mean, there's lots to say about this, including stuff that I'm not competent to speak on, really. The way that this problem is often framed, abstracting away from the details about the particular constants and just talking about it in general terms, if various parameters were slightly different, the universe would have looked very different. Either it would have only lasted for a tiny fraction of a second, or it would have blown apart really quickly. And so you might think, okay, so why is the universe the way it is, rather than having been a universe that only lasted for a tiny fraction of time, or that blew apart so quickly that you didn't get formation of stars, you just have clumping, as you said, clumping of hydrogen or something like that. And it's an interesting question, what sort of explanations you might hope to give here. How might you hope to answer that question? What are competing hypotheses that you could give that would answer that question? So one hypothesis is going to be, it's just a brute fact that the thing came out there, right?
Oh, don't brute fact me, bro.
So no. So this is just listing the possibilities, right? The
Right.
explanations, things that you might think to say. Another thing that you might think to say, which is something that I favour, is to, although it's kind of complicated to explain why this looks attractive, is that actually there was no other values that those constants could have taken is necessary. A third thing that you might say is, and now it depends where you think in causal history the values of the constants were assigned. I mean, if you think about tracing back history, at the very first point in history, were the values of these constants fixed or not? So if they weren't, then at some point there's a transition from not being fixed to being fixed. And you might think that that was a matter of chance, in the same kind of way that you might think that in quantum mechanics, there are various kinds of transitions where you have a kind of chance distribution and you get some outcome, right? That's different from the kind of brute chance, which is what I'm imagining if it was fixed from the beginning, right? You might say it was brute. But if you say that there was this chance distribution, they had to fall somewhere and that's the way they fell out, then you've got an explanation that's satisfactory. So there's three possibilities. A fourth thing that you might try saying is that there's something prior to the universe that that's either selected the value or made possible an explanation of the value. So one way you can go is multiple universes, and there are lots of people who go that way. If you think that there's some vast range of universes and the values of the various constants are kind of uniformly distributed across those universes, then then what you'll end up saying is, sure, if there was just one universe, it would seem rather surprising that we got these values. But if you think that there are lots and lots of universes, then it's not so surprising that a universe came up with those values. And it's not surprising that this question is getting asked from within a universe where you have those values, because it couldn't be asked from within a universe that only lasted for a tiny fraction of a second or blew up really fast so that there was nothing but kind of clumps of hydrogen. And another hypothesis you might have is that there's an agent who selected the values, that there's something like a creator God who chose the values. So there's a range of things that you might say, and the question is going to be, how are we going to assess which one to choose? And ultimately, what reasons might we have for going one way rather than another? Okay, so is that...
No, that's great. It's just, I compare it to like a bank vault where you have like 12 digits to get in the vault. You look at the tape, a robber comes in and boom, he opens the door. So what is more likely, that this just happened by chance? And these numbers, like the expansion rate of the universe, all these precise parameters that just have to be right, or we just aren't going to be here. What's more likely, that this was by chance, or that there is, I mean, the bottom line, is it time to let God in the door with this because of these fine-tuning arguments?
So you look at the various hypotheses. So let's take a different case. Suppose that we run a lottery with 1 billion tickets, and you end up holding a winning ticket. What's more likely, that chance just gave you the winning ticket, or that it was a put-up job? You had a friend at the lottery who manipulated things so that you would get the winning ticket. It's not straightforward to rule out, or to rule out that it was just a matter of chance. That's just the way the numbers fell. In fact, that's what you should think. right? So once you know that there was a chance mechanism in place and you know how hard it would be for anything to intervene, the right thing to think is it was just chance, even though, you know, the odds that your ticket was the winning ticket was 1 in a billion. And it makes no difference, right? We can have a pan-galactic lottery once we've colonized the universes, and we can have as many tickets, you know, 10 to the 50 tickets, and still the same thing is going to be true. What matters is whether there's a mechanism. So that was why it's important to ask that question about where the values get fixed. If they're not fixed at the initial point, but they're fixed at some later point by essentially just happenstance, as happens in a lottery, the size of the numbers is irrelevant, right? That's a perfectly satisfying explanation. So one of the things you have to check with the physicists is whether they think that these values have always been fixed at the values that they've got, or whether there was some sort of transition in the universe and it was at that point that the values got fixed, right? So that was the point of raising that.
Okay.
There's nothing wrong with high improbabilities if you recognize that there was a chance process and this was one of the possible outcomes, then you can be quite satisfied with that as an explanation, as I would be if there was a pan-galactic lottery and, you know, there was one chance in 10 to the 50 that I won, but I ended up with the winning ticket, right?
Okay.
And I was confident that the people running the lottery were scrupulous, right? And it was hard to, and it, you know, there was no way that you could illegitimately influence the outcome and so on. Right, so that raises a question about the physics, which I don't know how to answer, whether the value's fixed right from the beginning or not.
Well, they think the fine structure constant might have been right from the get-go. And obviously the expansion rate of the universe has to be there from the beginning, because if it's too fast, galaxies won't form. If it's too slow, this expansion rate, the universe collapses into a black hole.
Right, but then suppose you imagine a model with inflation. It might be that the final expansion rate that you settle on is determined by chance during the period of inflation, and then it's not there from the get-go, right? It's part of what's really hard to discuss about this is that we don't exactly know what the very, very earliest part of the universe was like. So it's not clear that we know what was there from the get-go. Right?
Yeah, even Sean Carroll has said we don't know. We can wind it back to the first minute or 10 to the minus 43rd or whatever seconds, and we just don't know. All those things break down. Yeah. So you're exactly right. By the way, I enjoyed your. Go ahead.
No, that's.
I enjoyed your interview with on Unbelievable, but I think you got some stuff wrong. You think that you have the premises first, then you reach a conclusion. You realize that Christians start with the conclusion and then they find evidence to support their conclusion. It's very frustrating because you have people like Answers in Genesis that say the universe is 6,000 years old. They start with the conclusion, then they hire their PhD hacks to go and prove their conclusion. Is that frustrating to you?
So, I'm not sure whether it's right to say that you start with premises and kind of search for conclusions or something like that. But it is true that when we're comparing worldviews, what we're going to do is we're going to look to see what assumptions are made in the worldviews and what stuff you can explain from those assumptions in the worldviews. And if we're trying to take a kind of, to stand back and say, okay, is there some kind of neutral way in which we can work out which is better? That's the way we're going to proceed. Of course, it might be that in practice, lots of people are very confident in some of their beliefs and adjust their other beliefs around them, and that the beliefs that they've got help to determine what they attend to, what evidence they consider, and so on. But what I'm interested in, the question that I was interested in when I started talking about comparison of worldviews, is this question about whether, from what looks like a relatively neutral perspective, there's some reason to prefer one worldview to another. And as you know, if you read to the end of this book or some of my other books, I think that in the end, you're not going to be able to make a neutral determination that's going to satisfy everybody, that everybody's going to make this judgment in the same way. But that's kind of down the track.
Graham, we have a lot of, thank you for all of that. I wanted to just clarify something, and then we're going to take questions from our participants. When you said earlier, I know we had some questions come up, and I know from a Christian perspective, I am guilty of this. It seems like you did a pretty good job of offering, in the beginning, I thought, of defining how you see atheism, but you preferred and didn't prefer. You see it as a claim. And if I'm understanding your position on atheism correctly, it would be like me as a theist saying that polytheism isn't true. That's just a claim. That's not my worldview. Is that accurate to say that's how you're viewing atheism? Is just a part of your much larger, what you said, complex worldview, rather than it being the fundamental worldview? Is that how you view it, as just a part of a larger worldview rather than just a part and not a whole worldview? Because I know Christians tend to think, and I know I do sometimes, that we do look at atheism as a worldview and nothing else. If somebody says they're an atheist, we don't really listen to everything else that incorporates into their worldview. But it seems to be that that's what you're doing. It's just a part of your worldview. It's one answer to one claim. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, so that is how I see it. It will be a claim in any atheist worldview, right, that atheism is correct. But there'll be lots and lots of other things they believe about causal reality and values and norms and all kinds of other stuff that just doesn't follow from being an atheist. There are other independent commitments that they've got. And the same's going to be true if you're a theist. So if you're a theist, you're going to have this commitment to theism, the claim that God exists. And but you'll have some commitments about what God's like, and different theists have different views about that. And then there'll be this other stuff, lots of other stuff that you're committed to, stuff about mathematics or geography or all kinds of things that's not entailed by theism, right? And that will all be part of your worldview as well. And what's interesting is how much of your worldview is relevant to whether or not you're a theist or an atheist, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you're familiar with kind of discussions, there are lots and lots of arguments on both sides from all kinds of subject matters that people think, whether correctly or not, are relevant to working out whether God exists or whether there's no God.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to take all that other stuff into account, depending who you're talking to. You have to find out what they think about all that other stuff in order to have the conversation.
Sure. Sure. I think for me as a Christian, I look at it and I say, well, God affects, or I tend to think that God's existence affects everything that I do. And I think what I've done in the past is apply that to the category of atheism. But not all atheists look at atheism as the source from which all other things flow, as Christians look to God as the source. So it seems to be, for me, I was really trying to understand that position better. And I think your book helped me to do that. So I appreciate that. And one question, and then we'll go to our group. Are you familiar with Mary Midgley, the late British philosopher? I think she was an agnostic atheist. Do you know who she was?
So I've read some of her books. I was not sure what her religious views.
Yeah, I wasn't either. It was not clear in anything that she wrote that I understood. The reason I bring her up is because she mentions Jacques Monod, who was a biologist, who uses the chance lottery to describe, I don't know if they're talking about abiogenesis or natural selection's account of life development over millions of years. But Midgley says something, and you brought up lotteries, and I wanted to get your thought on this. Midgley's idea was that lotteries presuppose a kind of intelligence. So Monod could play the game, but what he's bringing into the argument, it's sort of a tacit sneaking in of sentient intelligence into the argument. Lotteries involve laws and currency and rules and regulations and things that have been constructed by sentient human beings. So when we're talking about cosmic lotteries or biological lotteries, this seems to be, at least in Midgley's perspective, somewhat disingenuous. I'm not saying that you're being disingenuous, but her argument against Monod was you can't sneak in all these concepts of intelligence into a lottery argument for the existence of the cosmos or life itself. Does that make sense?
So I think that talking about lotteries would be may well have the implications that Midgley's talking about, but in physics, people will talk about chance distributions where there's no implication of intelligence, right? So if you think in radioactive decay, if you've got a kind of a radioactive atom, there'll be a chance distribution for its decay in the next 60 seconds, or I mean,
millennia.
It'll have a half-life, whatever it is, which could be
right.
just small or large. And there, the talk about chance is perfectly in order, but it's not like there's a lottery there.
Okay, so it's just
and what I said before wasn't. I mean, I wasn't relying on facts about lotteries as opposed to chance distributions. It's just that in a well-run lottery, you also end up with a chance distribution.
Okay,
right.
So your mechanism there is chance, but to be fair to you, you're not. Are you or are you not saying that chance in this capacity of an explanatory mechanism, that chance doesn't have causal powers, or does it? It's just an uncategorized reason we don't know, or is it there's some
so I'm thinking that chance goes along with indeterminism. So if you're thinking about causation, it's more like absence, right?
Okay.
There's a range of things that could happen. One of them does, and there's nothing that explains why that thing happens rather than all of the other alternatives, right? That's the thing that's left up to chance. Whereas if you're thinking about kind of regular deterministic causation, given everything else, you had to get this outcome, given the stuff that you had before. There's a kind of necessitation there that's missing from indeterministic causation.
Okay. Sean, we'll go to questions now. Sean Mixon, you had popped in and wanted to ask Graham something, so fire away. Graham, Sean is an up-and-coming philosopher, I understand, correct, Sean? Right?
Yes, sir. I was just hired to teach philosophy at a community college. And,
congratulations. Congratulations.
Yeah, it's a dream.
So fire away, Sean.
So, yeah. Graham, it's a privilege to speak with you. I've been reading your book, The Best Argument, The Best Case for Atheism. If I even got the title right. But I have a series of questions. I've also listened to several interviews. The discussion on does math point to God with Bill Craig. The discussion with Rob Coons on is necessary being to God. Listen to your talk with Joshua Rasmussen, and so I have several questions, and I'll just fire them out, and you can answer whichever one, or I'll just get back in line and ask later on. But
so give me one. It's kind of hard to remember more than one question at a time.
Okay.
So.
All right. Okay, so I'll start with this. I think this is probably I'll ask the yes or no one, and then I'll ask the big one. But is this your view that whatever is non-initial has a cause?
So has a cause, right? So when you've got indeterministic causation, you've got a cause, but you don't have a kind of total cause. There's something that's left up to chance. So I think of causal reality as unfolding indeterministically, but everything that's not initial has a causal history, and so it has a cause. And typically things have lots of causes, like an explosion, you need oxygen and a match, and you need the match to be struck and so on, right?
Okay, and so you reject Bill Craig's, you reject whatever begins to exist has a cause, because you believe that the universe, the initial state, began to exist and it's necessary. and
Yeah,
that
and so it doesn't have a cause, right? But this I have in common with theistic worldviews, because typically theistic worldviews think that causal reality begins with God, and God doesn't have a cause, right? And typically, though not always, like Richard Swinburne doesn't agree with this, but typically theists think that God's necessary, right? So there's just a parallel between the two worldviews.
Okay, and but you disagree with Locke, because Locke wants to point out that that God doesn't have a beginning. But the question is, your view. You say what we should be doing is, rather than giving arguments, because arguments kind of lead us astray, we should compare worldviews, and the best theory or hypothesis will have the best trade-off between explanation and simplicity. If you can lower the commitments and increase the ability to explain our observations, then that's a better view. What the question is, that do you think that necessarily translates to truth? Because I can think of some examples where you could have a theory that is more simple and explains more and posits less entities, but it's false.
So I think that's harder than you suppose when you've got enough data. And so an example that I sometimes give is, think about the difference between Newton's theory and Einstein's theory of so theories of gravitation and what I think is that is a sort of, I mean, this might seem controversial, but I don't think it is. Einstein's theory explains everything that Newton's theory explains and more, right? But Einstein's theory is also simpler. There are fewer absolute objects postulated in Einstein's theory. He gets rid of absolute space and time, whereas Newton has those as postulates. The mathematics that was invented to enable Einstein's theory was much more difficult than the mathematics that Newton invented in order to make possible his theory of gravitation. But you can write both of the theories in that more complicated language, the language of that was invented to enable Einstein to express the theory of general relativity. And then it turns out that the expression of Einstein's theories is simpler than the expression of Newton's theory. So when you understand the complexity of theory in the right way, it turns out both that Einstein's theory explains more and that it's simpler than Newton's theory. Now, that's a very nice example. It's very hard to come up with a scientific theory that's better than Einstein's, right? So that's a kind of case where I think that it's not true. The thing that you said is not true, that it's kind of easy to come up with theories that are both simpler and explain more, right? It's very hard to, and I don't think we've really got there yet to come up with a kind of successor theory to Einstein's that does better than his theory. I mean, might seem like a bit of a leap, but I think that in general, so long as we're thinking about sufficiently complex cases, it's not easy to come up with simpler theories that explain more.
I think to your point, both Sean and Graham, the idea, this was something that I had thought about long and hard yesterday and today, about the idea of simplicity and explanatory power and scope, but I'll pause that because I'll come back to that question at the end because we have a lot more. Joshua, you are next. If you got a question for Graham, fire away.
Yeah, Dr. Oppy, I really like the third chapter in your book, Snapshots from History, and I also appreciated that my past professor, Dr. Weikart's Hitler's Religion, made it into the book, because I think he did a good job pointing out the diversity of philosophies and religions within the Nazi hierarchy. My question is basically kind of historical. It's not like vital to truth worldviews, but it's just how would you categorize the beliefs of David Hume and Spinoza? Because it's obviously debated whether they qualify as atheists or not. And, you know, it's debated whether Spinoza was like spiritualist, naturalist, and was Hume really an atheist? Because even in the dialogues posthumously published, he seems to just be really cagey about where he lands. I was just curious of your thoughts on it.
Okay, so you'll know from the chapter that the first few people that I just did talk about from kind of ancient and medieval times, it's unclear whether we want to classify them as atheists or not.
Right.
And you've picked some hard cases. There are other hard cases. Hobbes is another one where it's, you know, there's a lot of debate about whether he's an atheist or not. It's worth knowing, so I'll talk about Hume. And it's worth knowing something about the historical background here. So Hume was born in 1711 in Edinburgh. In 1897, Thomas Aikenhead was hanged in Edinburgh for public expression of atheism, right? There were anti-blasphemy laws in the UK in the 17th century, and they were sometimes enacted, right? It's understandable in those circumstances that Hume was quite cagey about what he said publicly, right? And so it's kind of conjectural what his actual views were. He certainly, I mean, his friends knew that he wasn't religious. So Johnson, the biographer, went to see Hume when he was dying and was quite surprised and kind of dismayed that Hume seemed quite cheerful about dying and wasn't in the least bit inclined to accept any kind of religious proposals that were put to him, even though he was dying. But that would be consistent with his being a deist or an agnostic. My own hunch is that he's an atheist. And I have a paper that's coming out in a book that Paul Russell is editing on Hume's dialogues, where I try to make a case for that, which really follows the kind of case that Paul Russell himself made in his really excellent book on Hume on religion. But it's super controversial, and it's very hard to, I mean, given that anybody who wrote on these matters at that time would have been very careful to disguise their real opinions if they were atheists. And if you look at the historical record, you don't actually find anybody in the UK owning up to being an atheist and putting their name to it until after Hume was dead.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think he was too, but even posthumously, he seems to have been really careful about it. And I do think Spinoza is more pantheistic than atheist. That label gets thrown around a lot, especially the deists, even though they seem to believe there's a God. I also saw in the chat, I said pastor instead of professor. No, Richard Weikart is not ordained. He's a historian. Just want to clarify.
So,
right.
So Spinoza is a harder case, but I'm not a Spinoza scholar. And I really have no idea what to say.
Wasn't it Einstein that said he believed in Spinoza's God, or was it the other way around? Spinoza believed in Einstein's God. Either way. Eric Hernandez. Hey, Eric, how are you doing? If you want to turn your microphone on, it is your time on the spotlight to ask Dr. Oppy a question about mind.
Yeah, Dr. Oppy, it's a pleasure to be able to talk with you. What view of mind would you say is most consistent with the naturalist perspective, and what view of mind do you hold to?
Okay, so I think there's quite a range of disagreement amongst naturalists about mind. There are some people who claim to be naturalists who claim to be dualists. They're a very small minority. It tends to be the case that people who are naturalists prefer to be functionalists or physicalists about the mind. My own view, which is a kind of identity, sort of restricted type identity theory. So I think for if you think about what beliefs and desires and intentions and mental states and mental processes are. There are some people like the churchlings who want to say that they want to be eliminatists about them, say that there's no such things. I'm not inclined to go that way. I'm inclined to say that beliefs and desires and intentions and mental states, mental processes generally just are certain kinds of neural processes in us. So this is what beliefs, desires, and intentions are in us, certain kinds of neural states and processes in us that have the right kind of evolutionary history, connection to the environment, connections to behavior, and so on. So there's an old debate that what goes back to the 1960s about the consistency of functionalism and the identity theory. Australians like Jack Smart and David Armstrong tended to think that they were consistent. Americans like Hilary Putnam tended to think that they were inconsistent. I side with the Australians, which is perhaps not surprising. So my view is very similar to the view that Jack Smart had.
So would you consider, so are you reducing them to something physical in a strong or weak ontological reduction? And would you say that the naturalist who tries to be a dualist is bloating his ontology?
So that's what I would say. I think that the most economical theory is the identity theory, right? It's not a limitivist, and it's not really a reduction either. It's just that we have mental states, and what they are neural states, right? There are mental processes. What they are is neural processes, and that's highly economical. I don't say that it's reductive, and it depends. I mean, it's kind of tricky to say exactly what's required in order to have a reduction of one theory to another or one part of language to another. But I don't think that I could tell you, say, pick one of your beliefs, right? Something that you believe. There's no way that I can specify just in the vocabulary of neural sciences exactly which neural process or neural state that particular belief is. So I don't believe, that we could talk about ourselves without using the vocabulary of beliefs, desires, and intentions, that we could, as the churchlings sometimes imagine, we could just talk about parts of the brain and neural states and be able to interact with one another and describe each other in those terms. I don't think that we can do that. Nonetheless, as far as the ontology goes, that's all there is, right? And when we're talking about beliefs, desires, and intentions, we are just talking about our neural states or the neural processes that we undergo.
So if you don't mind me following up on that, what would you do with Leibniz's law of identity, where there seems to be things true of mental states, like thoughts and beliefs, that are not true of neural states?
So seems to be, right, is what you said. And I don't think that that's going to be a problem, because it just ain't so, right? In neural states, there's nothing more to mental states than neural states. There's nothing more to mental processes than neural processes, right? That's the identity theorist view.
Being true or false, but my correlated group of neurons firing aren't true or false.
So, but the neurons are not the states and the processes, right? So your being in a certain kind of neural state has a certain kind of content, and the content is either true or false, right? So there's no, I mean, of course, the neurons themselves are just things. They're not the right, and they're not in the right ontological category to be assessed as true or false. They exist or they don't. They have certain properties or they don't, and that's it. But just as your believing is a certain kind of state, and that state has a content, and that content enables the belief to be assessed as either true or false, so your being in a certain kind of neural state has a certain kind of content, and it's having that content enables it to be assessed as true or false.
So then would you consider yourself a property dualist? Because then it would seem like there would be more to than just neural states from what you're saying.
So no, I don't consider myself to be a property dualist. I think that as I said, there's nothing more to our beliefs, desires, and intentions than the neural states and processes. The kind of difficulty here is that we don't have a vocabulary where we can pick out the particular neural states and the particular neural processes, except by way of talking about beliefs, desires, and intentions. That's the only handle that we've got on them.
Yeah, and that would, to me, point to the fact that there's two things at play, two properties. But I appreciate the interaction. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, Graham. Thanks, Eric. Good questions. Excuse me. Mike, you had a real simple question about the book if you want to ask Graham. And then
Right.
Sean, we'll get back to you after Mike's done, okay?
Okay, yeah. I'm apologizing for not having been able to read the book. I usually do, but just life happens and I'll do that. So it looked like, the title of your book is Atheism, the Basics, and it seems like most of the questions are far beyond the basics of that. So I'm just wondering what a few of the basics that you have in the book could be summarized as, and I may want to ask you one or two things about those, but what are you see as the basics?
Okay, so I agree with you. All the questions are focused on the part of the book where there's a warning at the beginning that says this part of the book is not basic, right? So the book itself starts off with a discussion about just what atheism is and how it's distinguished from lots of things that it might be conflated with, how it relates to things like materialism or physicalism or communism, lots of things that some people sometimes conflate with atheism, but which is different from.
There can be overlap, but not identity.
So that's the first chapter. The next chapter, if I might as well refer to the table of contents while I'm doing this, is the chapter that Joshua talked about, where there's a dozen historical people that I write little biographies of, interesting atheists from history. So, for example, there's one of the people I look at is George Eliot, who not everybody knows, but she was an atheist. And there's a bunch of other people that I look at as well. So that's the second chapter.
Biographies are always interesting.
The third chapter is more about sort of some facts and figures about atheism. So there's some stuff about demography, about the distribution of atheists historically and in the present, and then some stuff about what various sciences, especially psychological sciences, say about atheists. So that's none of that's meant to be philosophical. I refer to various kind of meta studies that look at atheists and consider features about atheists. And that kind of goes way beyond what I really have any proper expertise in. But it was kind of interesting to read into the social science on the subject.
That raises a question, if I could pop in quickly, about the psychology of atheism. It seems like atheism is, and you could probably give more stats than I have on that, is rather rare in the history of the world. Is there something in the human psychology that is more attuned to, I don't know, should we call it non-atheism? We don't want to call it Christianity because that's a little too specific.
So there's interesting recent work in cognitive science of religion, which suggests that maybe there is some kind of disposition that naturally leads lots of us to believe in something more, gods of one kind or another, or some other kinds of supernatural structures. I mean, in some Eastern religions, maybe you don't have to believe in gods, but you believe in karma and reincarnation, stuff like that. There's some science that maybe does point in that direction. And certainly historically, the historical record doesn't present us with lots of atheists. Two things to say about that. There were one of the philosophical schools in ancient India, the Charvakas, were atheists. Their records are not really preserved except in the writings of their enemies, so we're not entirely sure about all of their beliefs, and they kind of fizzled out by about the 12th century. The second thing is that history is written almost all from the perspectives of the wealthy and the powerful, and we just don't have records that tell us about the beliefs of ordinary folk and whether there were in fact amongst the ordinary folk people who were not believers. I mean, I'm thinking about Western Europe here. And it's kind of interesting that the Charvakas, the way that their enemies referred to them was as having the beliefs of common people, which is kind of interesting and might suggest something about the possibility that there were atheists. We just don't know about them because they were not amongst the elites. That's entirely speculative. There's just no data, and it's hard to get it because the people who weren't elites were by and large illiterate. They didn't keep diaries, and so there just isn't evidence.
Right. Yeah. It seems, I'm wondering if this ties in with, I don't know about Australia, but modern USA, there's a rise of the people who label themselves as nuns. They don't want to really identify with any particular religion, but they're into karma and crystals and astrology and something beyond. And it's very difficult to find somebody who's says there's nothing but material. And even, we have these mass shootings, unfortunately, and we say, oh, we send you thoughts and prayers. And I thought, okay, prayers from a theistic perspective, I can understand, but thoughts, what help does that give? But they're invoking something or other at that point. So anyway, it just seems like there seems to be, and I don't know how many, there seems to be a natural tendency toward looking beyond the purely materialistic, I guess. So
it's an interesting question. What percentage of populations in, say, in the wealthier countries, what are sometimes called advanced countries, right? Wealthier countries. What percentage of them have beliefs like mine, naturalists, who think that there's no stuff beyond the natural? And the data on this is very patchy. People who make surveys trying to find out this sort of stuff ask the wrong questions, and so they don't get useful answers in general. That's something I talk about in the book. It wouldn't be, I think, as high as 1% in the United States or in Australia.
Yeah,
right? It's quite I would think that it's quite a small minority, but it's certainly a minority that lots of evangelists seem to be greatly worried by, even though it's so tiny.
Right. Yeah, and it'd be interesting to try and broaden the perspective of the studies, because I lived about 5 years, and most of that in a remote Ghanaian village in West Africa. I don't think you'd find an atheist or even atheist leaning among anybody there. And in many of the, I won't say primitive, but less technologically advanced societies, it just doesn't seem to be the case. We say, okay, what is their religion? And it's all kinds of things all over the place. But yeah, they have to have something that they always have something in place.
So it's interesting. The last of my case studies was Agomo Atambire, who was born in 1989, an atheist in Ghana. So, right, it's not unheard of.
Right.
But
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
he's in a very tiny minority in
Yeah.
Ghana.
Right. And even there's the educational elite, and then there's the anyway, there's different levels of society even there too. Yeah. Okay, I'll turn it over to somebody else for a while, unless there's another chapter that you'd like to summarize really quickly.
Maybe I should, because I got sort of halfway through. So
Sorry
the
to cut
next,
you off, but not
so
very.
so the next chapter is a kind of, I called it common complaints. Lots of things that are alleged about atheists that turn out not to be true. That, I mean, I focus quite a lot on kind of aspersions about their moral characteristics, but you know, there's a whole range of things that are kind of common stereotypes of atheists that the social science tends not to bear out. And then there's the kind of reasons and arguments chapter, which is the thing that most people want to talk about, even though it's kind of, it's very compressed in this book, and I've talked about it at much greater length in other books. And then I talk a little bit about the future of atheism and say something about new atheists. And the kind of main point I make in that chapter is that the future is very hard to predict in general. And it's very hard to know whether even in the West, the numbers of atheists, they will continue to grow or whether they'll shrink. I mean, it's particularly hard because we don't even have a good fix on what the numbers are really, right? For the reasons that you gave. Lots of censuses until recently had a box for none, but they don't have a box for naturalist. They never have had. There's no census anywhere that has a box for naturalists. So it's very hard to get the data.
Yeah. Yeah. Oppy, Graham, I had just interviewed on our podcast. I don't know if you know who Ryan Burge is. He's primarily responsible for his tweet going viral a couple of years about the statistics put out by the General Social Survey here in the United States. It was a survey created in Chicago in the 1970s, I believe it was. But we talked about categories, and I asked him, I said, how do you think surveys impact how we see religious belief? And I like what you just said there, because it was the thrust of our discussion. These were categories created by sociologists at the University of Chicago in the 1970s. So categorically, they're coming up with the labels, and we're just kind of going with them, you know. But you're right. There is no naturalist. There's no materialist. There's no substance dualist there, you know. There's no polytheist. I guess some of them are lumped under there, but for statistical and survey purposes, the questions are kind of simplified along those lines. So it's true what you say there about it. But I had
can I add something else?
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
I think that this matters because there's a small amount of research in psychology from the 90s. The first paper I know about is a paper by a woman, I think her name was Catherine Ross, in about 1990, who was investigating various ways in which various studies which seemed to suggest that there were benefits that accrued to theists of various kinds, health benefits and various other kinds of things, and were attributed to the kind of beliefs that theists had. And what she thought was these benefits are going to be tied not to the content of the beliefs, but to the way that you hold them, whether you hold them robustly, whether you've got a robust set of values and a robust set of beliefs. And there's been some research ever since which has suggested that she's right about that. But that means that using the category of the nuns as a basis for policy decisions is just terrible, because for reasons that we've just been considering, lots of the nuns have flip-floppy values and flip-floppy beliefs, right? And you're not actually focusing on the properties that matter.
Right, exactly.
I'll just say thanks for answering my questions. I may have to leave a little bit early, but it's a good thing to have an overview. So thank you.
Yeah. Graham, I wanted to just, Sean has another question. You talked to Sean earlier, and this was something that I wanted to clarify, and this I think will lead back into Sean's question a little bit. But I think the thrust of your argument, I think it's chapter 6, you're making the claim that the best atheist big pictures have fewer theoretical commitments than the best theistic big pictures. and that there is no data that theistic big pictures can explain better than atheist big pictures. From these two claims, given the account of theoretical virtue, it follows that best atheist big pictures are superior to best theistic big pictures. So I'll just ask one question, because I know stacking questions is kind of difficult. When you're talking about atheist big picture, using that terminology, to me as a theist, that sounds like worldview language, getting back to our earlier discussion. So when you mean atheist big picture, how are you not suggesting, let's just say, that atheism isn't some kind of worldview when you talk about it as a bigger picture? How would you respond to that?
So what I think is kind of interesting to compare would be something like a best atheistic worldview and a best theistic worldview.
Okay.
And what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about worldview or big picture, I mean, there's a distinction, and I can always remember which way I draw the distinction. What I'm really interested in is what you might call a theory of everything. So it's sort of everything that you would believe if you kind of had an opinion about every proposition.
Gotcha.
Right. That's the sort of thing that I've got in mind. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay. You're not saying that in saying atheist big picture, you're not saying atheism is a worldview. You're saying an atheist with an opinion or a belief about everything, in a sense.
Yeah. So that there's got to be an account of norms and an account of values and an account of mathematics. There's a whole lot of things that have to be in there. And of course, like theists, atheists will disagree amongst themselves about what's the best account of value or the best account of norms or the best account of mathematics and so on. But what you're really interested in comparing would be a best version of theism and a best version of atheism. There's not really any point in comparing sort of inferior worldviews, right? You want to compare the best on each side.
Right,
yeah.
right. Sean, I don't know if that led into what you were talking about earlier. I think it did, but if not, go ahead and jump in and start where you want to there.
Thank you. So I guess I was trying to, the best worldview will have it would have the best trade-off between explanatory scope and commitments. And what my question was asking is, where does truth play into that? Because what I was saying is that I can think of situations where you have a simple explanation that is more simpler and explains more, but it is also false. So are you just saying that this, because you talked to, it seems like your framework is more about dialectic than it is about like finding out like what is actually truth is true. It seems to me as though you were speaking more to conversations between theists and atheists and how they don't seem to get anywhere. So what we need to do is we need to move away, step back from arguments and look at our worldviews. And the role of arguments is to show inconsistencies between one another's worldview. So if I can show how some of the propositions within your worldview entails, or you say you don't use entail, logically, it has a logical consequence of a contradiction, then that's a point for me. But so I guess that's what I'm saying. I'm like, is it more about just persuading someone else, or do you think simplicity, the best trade-off between simplicity and explanatory scope or breadth or depth leads to truth?
So there's a question here about whether we should think that the best views that we can achieve, the best view that we can achieve is going to be true or not. Certainly in practice, the best that you and I, you can do, or I can do, or anyone can do, is bound to be a view that has lots of falsehoods in it, right? There's no way that any of us is capable of having a set of beliefs where there's just no false beliefs in there. I mean, setting aside the problem that we can't have beliefs about everything anyway. So that's kind of one point. The second thing is, suppose it was true that we actually could do, and I make a point of saying that this is kind of a thought experiment. It's not achievable in practice, but suppose that we could write out the very best theistic worldview and the very best atheistic worldview and the very best worldviews of various other kinds. And then we could do this kind of pairwise comparison. We settle on a winner, right? This is the view that does the best job of managing the trade-off between minimizing your commitments and maximizing explanation. Is there anything better than we could do than to think that, well, okay, so that's the worldview that's most likely true, right? I mean, clearly, given that the other views do worse, they're less likely to be true than this one is. Should we think that this one's true? Well, we should certainly be a bit cautious about that because of all the various kinds of limitations that we have, both sort of individually and collectively. Right? It doesn't mean that truth isn't a goal for inquiry. It just means that you should be fairly cautious about claiming that you've got it, all of it, and nothing else.
So, Oppy, what do you think of Alvin Plantinga's statement that Christianity is properly basic? Like there's some things like truth, beauty, whatever, that you don't have to give it an explanation for. They're just properly basic. You're familiar with that argument, I'm sure, right?
Right. So this takes us into a different topic, really, because now we're thinking about sort of our ongoing believing. We're not imagining this kind of ideal end state, right? So I think there's a whole lot of stuff you have to take for granted as a believer, as a believing subject or as an agent. You have to take for granted, except where you've got reason to think otherwise, that your senses are basically reliable. When you see things, what you see is really there. When you hear things, what you hear is really there. And when you see things, they are as they seem to be. Right. I mean, of course, there's all kinds of defeating conditions. If it's foggy and the thing is far away, you better not be too confident about what it is. If you've had a few too many drinks, maybe you shouldn't be too confident about those snakes that you're seeing and so on, right? But in general, in good conditions, you've got to think that your senses are pretty reliable, and you've got to think in a similar kind of way that your kind of rational capacities are reasonably reliable as well. Again, fallible, just like the senses are, but basically you're going to rely on them most of the time. And slightly less obvious, but also very important, a lot of the time you can trust what other people say, and we spend a lot of time trying to work out who's reliable and what topics they're reliable and so on. But a lot of the stuff that you believe, in fact, nearly all of it, you believe on the testimony of other people. Right, and so that's got to be a kind of basic thing that we do as well. So there's a whole lot of stuff, right, that's, as it were, properly basic, right? Stuff that we've just got to take for granted in order to be functioning epistemic agents. Is it true that belief in God is properly basic? Well, Plantinga thinks so. But it's kind of interesting that there's a difference between the belief in God and the other things that I've talked about. The other things are kind of universal, cross-cultural, independent of history, independent and so on, right? You're not going to be a successful human being unless you trust your senses, trust your reason, trust what authorities say. Can you flourish without believing in God? Surely. There are whole cultures. Consider ancient China that was packed with flourishing people who didn't believe in Plantinga's God, right? So there's a difference between that one that you might think is a reason for being skeptical about whether it's properly basic, right? If you think that the properly basic things are going to be things that are just universal to people generally, then that one won't make it. Now, I don't know what Plantinga would have said in response to that point. But it's obvious, I think, that you're going to find that there are lots of people who are going to disagree with planting that belief in his particular God is properly basic, but we'll accept that there's all kinds of other stuff that is properly basic. Okay, so does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Sean, go ahead and finish. I know Bill jumped in there like he does. So finish up, Sean. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, Dr. Oppy, so you mentioned that the theory that posits more entities and it's more complex and it has less explanatory scope. You said it's less likely to be true. Now that phrase "less likely to be true" doesn't seem to me to be necessarily true. I guess that's what my point. Are you talking about doxastic likelihood, or are you referring to metaphysical? Because I'm thinking metaphysically, it seems like the worst theory can be true, right? Couldn't there be a possible world in which the worst theory that has more entity and all the great sciences are the worst sciences? Because in this world, the worst theories are the true ones. That seems like a possibility. So how does that connect to truth?
Right. Okay, so there's a kind of background issue here about possibility. So I'm a kind of Aristotelian about possibilities. I think that in the kind of broadest sense, leaving aside merely formal, logical possibilities, the right way to think about modality is to think that all possible worlds share some history with the actual world and branch off from it only because chances play out differently, right? This gives you a much narrower range of possibilities than on the more familiar, if you can conceive it, it's possible view, which I don't accept. The reason why it's relevant here is because I think that the only agents that we're going to have, apart from ones that are created by the agents I'm about to describe, are biologically evolved creatures. And those biologically evolved creatures are inevitably going to have faculties that in many respects are like ours. They'll be perceivers, they'll be reasoners, they'll have emotions and so on. And it's not going to be the case that you can have creatures like that with a long period of evolutionary history that end up with radically wrong beliefs about their environments, about the world in which they live. It has to be the case that there's lots of stuff that if your perceptual faculties are not tuned to your environment, if to take a fanciful example of J.P. Moreland's, if you systematically mistake big things for little things and vice versa, then when it comes to predators, you'll be running away from infant predators and getting swallowed by large ones, right? You just can't systematically make mistakes like that. So that's the kind of response that I want to make to your proposal. It actually isn't going to turn out that that we could be systematically wrong in our believing on the kind of scale that you're imagining. It has to be the case that we've got lots of true beliefs about our immediate environment, predators, what we can eat, and so on.
Any follow-up, Sean?
If you feel that that's satisfactory or not, but that's how I'm inclined to respond.
You said that it has to be the case, but what propositions, what statements on your theory does that follow from?
So it follows, there's a lot of things that feed into this, right? So part of it is the Aristotelian conception of modality. Part of it is a commitment to the truth of evolutionary theory. Part of it, I guess, is a commitment to the truth of naturalism as well. So there can't be supernatural deceivers that are, misleading us, right? There's quite a lot of stuff that's going to feed in there to get out that conclusion. Right? I'm not too worried about kind of filling in the details, right? I just think that it seems kind of straightforward.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Graham. Joshua, you're up. You want to ask a follow-up question? You are on deck. Go for it.
Yeah, the fact that planning it got brought up, I was just curious, Dr. Oppy, what your epistemology was. I know in your debate book with Kenny Pierce, you said you adopt Reedian epistemology, but I don't know exactly what Thomas Reid believed. I got to ask Tim McGrew this question. I said, is Reid a foundationalist and an externalist? Because I'm not a philosophy guy. I read history. So I was just curious if you're an internalist or a foundationalist, or, you know, maybe that's not your wheelhouse.
So I guess partly it isn't really my thing, but what I said before was basically my account of what I think Reedian epistemology amounts to, right? There's a whole lot of capacities that we've got that we trust. And I think that Reid may go a little bit too far in that he doesn't notice the extent to which we monitor our faculties, correct them according to circumstances, and so on. You know, so I mean, it's very obvious when it comes to testimony, the monitoring that we're doing in determining who we think are the people that we should trust when they tell us stuff. But it's, I see it there with vision as well. But I think that you don't have an option to not trust your visual senses, in, you know, your sense of sight in general. And Reid picks on a bunch of things, and he includes testimony, and he includes memory, and he includes the senses, and then he includes this other stuff, these kind of intuitions about the divine. And that bit, I take leave from him at that point, right? But otherwise, we're kind of in agreement, right? That's the kind of basics of, for me, of epistemology.
I see. What do you think of foundationalist internalism? I mean, I just finished the McGrew's book on it, and I'm really attracted to that view because it seems like it avoids begging the question, and I'm thinking that's the way to go. And I'm a Christian, but I don't think planning is right. I don't even think God's a properly basic belief. I was just curious about that. I know Kenny Pierce kind of dismisses classical foundationalism. Thanks for answering my question, by the way. You know,
right. So I guess I mean, it depends what you think the foundationals are going to be. Plantinga thinks that there are propositions that are foundational, whereas what I said was more that there are faculties and attitudes towards your faculties that are foundational. And so maybe I don't think there's any propositions like the proposition that God exists that it's appropriate to take as properly basic.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
Yeah, thank you. I think Descartes was basically right, and just incorrigible beliefs are like the only thing that we cannot question. But I appreciate your responses, and thank you for taking time with all of us.
Yes.
Graham, to follow up with the last two, this brief question, then we'll go to a couple others. With this argument of commitments, theoretical commitments and maximal explanatory power and scope, given naturalism, I think Sean was I hope I'm not mischaracterizing what Sean was trying to ask, but maybe this is the same question in a different, wordedly different. But given these two commitments that you have, given these two propositions that you have, these premises that the less theoretical commitments you have and the more explanatory scope and power you have, the better the worldview, the better the bigger picture. But if we grant naturalism, from where do we derive these two basic premises? It doesn't seem like anything in nature itself would necessarily give us one preference over another in terms of how we would explain things. As I was reading this, if naturalism is true to me, and I'm fuzzy in my head about this, but maybe you can clarify how you see it, that given naturalism, that these two premises ought to be or should be employed when assessing worldviews. How in naturalism do we determine that these are the criteria by which we assess bigger pictures?
Right. So maybe it'll be useful for me to say something about how I'm thinking about naturalism here. So I think of naturalism as a claim about causal reality. What it says is that the only causes that there are natural causes, and the only causal properties that there are natural causal properties. Naturalism itself is silent on questions about values, norms, methodologies, and so on. So it's not a consequence of naturalism, right? It's the worldview is naturalistic because it accepts that much, right? There are only natural causes, natural causal properties. But that can't be a complete worldview. You've got to say something about a whole range of other topics, right? I mean, that says nothing about mathematics. It says nothing about what's right. It says nothing about what's obligatory, and so on. So,
Okay.
So in a naturalistic worldview, the kind of naturalistic worldview that I like, there's some other stuff that's doing various kinds of things. So for mathematics, I think that there's no mathematical ontology, and quite generally, I don't like abstract objects. But I do think that there are necessary truths, right? So
Okay.
there's a kind of one approach in philosophy of mathematics is sort of objectivity without objects. I forget who was the first person, maybe Hartree Field was one of the people who wanted to defend an approach like that. And so I find that attractive, and I want to expand that so that it's not just mathematics, but quite generally when it comes to questions about norms and values and so on. I don't think there's any ontology there, but I do think that there are necessary truths. Now, I could be wrong about all of that, right? Naturalists don't have to go the way I go, but that's the way that I go. That doesn't answer the question about the methodology. And I think, I mean, it could, because I could just try arguing, look, you know, it's just, these are just necessary truths. If you
Brute
think
facts.
about that, well, no, necessary truths are different, right? I mean, I do think that once you hit a necessary truth, so once you claim that something's necessary, that's where you stop. There's no explaining what's necessary, because it doesn't, if it's necessary, it's true no matter what. So you can't turn around and give a what that explains it, right? What you can do is show that if some things are necessary, other things are necessary. And then you can say all of the kind of, it's not like all the necessities are brute. There's a small number of them that are brute, right? You can't explain why they're true. And then you can explain all the others in terms of them. So you have some commitment to a bunch of necessary truths. And unless you do away with modality altogether, and there are some people who want to do that, unless you do away with it altogether, you're going to end up with some primitive necessary truths. So, I mean, if I ask certain kind of theists, why is God's existence necessary? They will probably say, we've reached the end of explanation at this point. That's just a primitive claim in my theory.
Okay.
Now, the methodology question is slightly different from that, because I want, when I was thinking about theories of everything, I wanted to pack as much as possible into the theories, right? We disagree about all kinds of things. But when it comes to the assessment question, that can't be packed into the theories, right? We have to have something left over. And so what I thought was, this is something fairly minimal that I think that I might be able to get agreement on. Now, maybe I can't, right? But I think that given that even questions about logic, for example, are going to be internal. Some people think that there can't be true contradictions. Other people think they can be. I want to pack that into the theories, right? What's left? Well, what I thought is this idea that when we're comparing the global theories, we ask about their theoretical virtues, right? So which is the more virtuous theory? Which is the better theory? That's the question. How are we going to assess that? Well, I think by seeing which does the best job of managing the trade-off between minimizing commitments and maximizing explanation. And I'm hoping that people will say, that sounds pretty plausible. If they don't, I don't know where we'll go, right? Because I'm not sure what else we could use that isn't obviously going to draw on controversial commitments, things that we disagree about within our theories, right? If we're going to manage this, we have to reach something that we can agree on, right? And so the question is whether you're going to agree on that or not, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I appreciate the response. It sheds a little bit more light on what I was reading. Phil, you wanted to ask a few questions. You are on, sir. Fire away.
Hello, Dr. Oppy. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Well, the first up is kind of an observation. I have interacted with I wouldn't say a great many atheists, but I would say I've interacted with a respectable number of atheists, and I've also seen debates and on YouTube and then books, where there's a back and forth between atheists and theists, and I very often hear something that I kind of find awkward, and it goes like something similar to what we were talking about during the beginning of the session. And that is, the atheist will say something like, atheism does not make any positive truth claims. In other words, atheism is not the thesis that God does not exist. That atheism is really more of a lack of a positive truth claim. We just lack the belief that God exists. And so if I apply that to theists, it seems like I can just say, well, I as a theist, I'm not making any positive truth claims either. I simply lack the belief that God does not exist. And if we frame it in those terms, I feel like I'm being consistent with the atheist claim, because the atheist is saying, I'm not making any positive truth claims. I just lack a belief that God exists. And I can say, well, I think I'm on the same footing if I say, well, I'm not making any positive truth claims either. I simply lack the belief that God does not exist. I mean, don't we all have to go home at that moment? I mean, isn't that the end of the discussion? And so that's kind of where I find a little bit of this awkward feeling, like why are theists expected to defend something that is supposed to be a positive truth claim, but the atheist doesn't have to defend something that is not a positive truth claim, So I kind of see this awkwardness going back and forth, and I've never heard an atheist explain to me why it's valid for them to have this intellectual lack of a claim, but the theists have to be responsible for their so-called positive truth claims, So that's really more of an observation than it is anything else. But the other thing that I really wanted to bring up, and I would just kind of like to throw us out there and just see what comments you would have about it. And that is, Stephen Hawking, in his book, I think it was in The Grand Design, if that's the proper title of the book. I think that's the right title. He said, if naturalism is true, that there's nothing more than just the laws of nature, and that the physical universe is all that exists, then we are nothing more than biological machines. That was the way Hawking put it. And as soon as he wrote that, it felt like he was suddenly faced with the implications of what he was saying. Because he said, if we are nothing more than biological machines, then it must follow that we don't have anything that we could properly call free will. Because machines don't have free will, and that's kind of an intuitive insight that pretty much, we all probably share. but it seems to me that there are a whole lot more implications to the idea that we are nothing more than biological machines than just we don't have any free will. Seems to me we could add a litany of implications that would follow from our being biological machines, and some of which would be, why do we even ask questions about existence and about our nature and about the universe in the first place? Machines don't ask questions about the nature of the universe. They simply store and retrieve information, you know. Why do we have this idea that there's such a thing as evil if we're just biological machines, and that we just, you know, we didn't come from anything that was intelligent or anything that had any kind of purpose? So I wrote a book called Machines Don't Laugh. And in the book, I'm exploring a whole list of things, of implications to the idea that we are nothing more than biological machines. And if we're nothing more than machines, why do we do the things that we have never seen machines do? And so I just kind of like to get your thoughts on that. And I suppose that may be a commitment, you know, that I'm making a commitment that I think that there's certain implications to being a machine, and but I think that there's a lack of explanation on the atheist side from all of the attributes that we actually have as human beings that we would not have if we were nothing more than machines. So I'll just put that out there, and you can respond to it however, you know, with whatever thoughts you might have.
Okay, so I'll start with the first thing about the kind of lack of belief, atheists. So I think it's kind of dialectically effective to say to them that you just lack the belief that God doesn't exist, right? It seems to me that the kind of lack of belief characterization of atheism is unsatisfactory for various reasons. One thing that it's worth thinking about here is the propositions that are in play and the attitudes that you can have towards them. So I'll just talk about God in the singular. So there's the claim that God exists and there's the claim that God doesn't exist. And I'm going to take for granted that you can't believe both of them, because that would be to embrace a contradiction, right? So that's ruled out. So what are your what attitudes can you have? Well, you might believe one and not the other. So, and I'm going to call those positions theism and atheism. But there are other attitudes. You might suspend judgment between them, and that position I'm going to call agnosticism, right? And if you are an agnostic, then you lack belief in either of those two propositions. There's also the possibility that you just never consider either of the propositions. You just don't have any attitude towards them. I call those people innocents, just for want of a title. But that kind of summarizes the ways in which you might be related to that pair of propositions. And it strikes me that the people who want to say that they lack just one of the beliefs haven't fully answered the question yet, because they haven't told you what their attitude towards the other proposition is. So if you say you lack the belief that God doesn't exist, I still want to know what you think about the proposition that God exists. And likewise, if an atheist, someone who calls themselves an atheist, says they lack belief in the proposition that God exists, I want to know what their attitude to the other proposition, namely the proposition that God doesn't exist, is. Right? Because they haven't told me what their position is until they've told me that thing, right? So I'm fully on board with your worries about that kind of internet atheism. The reason why people do it, I think, is because they think it gives them a dialectical advantage, because then they can say, you know, I don't have a position to defend here. But they do, right? If they've got a position at all, it's just they're not owning up to it. Right, their position might be that they're agnostic, right? But that's still a position, right? It's left open that they're agnostic or atheist, one or the other.
And if I could just interject real quickly, just to interject, my attitude, I guess if you want to talk about attitudes, I guess one of the observations that I've made is if someone says I lack a belief in God, then my follow-up question would be, then what's the difference between atheism and agnosticism? And so I kind of endorse, where you're going with this, and that is that you have to have something that you're going to bring to the table. You can't just have a vacuum that you're going to bring to the table, and so, so that was helpful. The way you put that, I think, was helpful and productive.
Right. So that's in the first chapter of Atheism, the basics. I talk about that, but I've talked about it elsewhere as well. On the second question, as I said before, naturalism, I mean, people use the word naturalism in different ways. And when Hawking said that he was a naturalist, he was probably giving himself a much stronger position than the one that I'm ascribing to myself when I call myself a naturalist. Because I think of naturalism as just a claim about causal reality, right? So it just says that the causes that there are natural causes and the causal properties that there are natural causal properties. It says nothing about a whole lot of other questions about values, norms, mathematics. There's lots and lots of things that claim about naturalism doesn't cover. There are some people who want to say that from naturalism narrowly construed that way, everything else follows. So you can get an ethics, an aesthetics, and a mathematics, and a whole lot of things out of the assumption that there are none but natural causes with none but natural causal properties. I just don't believe that, right? That claim is just neutral. It doesn't tell you anything about values, about morality, and so on. And so to get the kind of, we're just kind of meat machines out of naturalism, right? You can't be thinking about naturalism just in the way that I'm thinking about it. You have to be thinking about it in that much stronger, and I think completely implausible way, right? So I'm not going to, I don't agree with Hawkins, right? That somehow or other the thinking that there are none but natural causes with none but natural causal properties rules out our having free will or our having minds or our leading meaningful lives and so on. It just doesn't rule those things out. But the stronger claim probably would. Yeah.
Okay. Ken, you want to go ahead and ask your question? Thanks, Phil, for jumping in there. Ken Daniels, if you want to go ahead and ask Oppy, Graham, what your question is, fire away.
Yes, I arrived late, so pardon me if I ask a question that's already been asked before. But I did read a little article that Daniel posted, or at least most of it. I had a busy day, so I didn't read the whole thing. But when Daniel asked his question about how we should think about your claim that minimizing entities is a virtue as opposed to maximizing entities, and I think Sean also expressed this. I think what they're trying to get at, and excuse me if I'm misrepresenting it, but they're trying to get at a reason for why should we think that minimizing entities should be a better path to truth than maximizing entities. And what I'd like to hear from you perhaps is maybe some historical examples that we can all identify with where the act of minimizing entities led to the discovery or recognition of truths we now universally adopt. And one that comes to mind, and maybe you could offer a better example, is the whole idea of epicycles around geocentricity. They had to keep multiplying all these epicycles to prop up the idea that the Earth was the center of the universe. But then once heliocentrism was adopted, that minimized the number of entities, relatively speaking. And so that was more virtuous and ended up being something we all recognize as true today. But I was wondering if you could give other examples, maybe from historical settings, but also from our daily lives. Like if I lose track of my wallet, is it more, am I minimizing entities if I think, well, it must have been me that lost it versus maybe a thief that came in the house or a demon that took it away, because there have been times when I've lost my wallet and I thought there's got to be, some supernatural entity that took this away. There's
Sock
no
monster. The sock
Yeah.
monster.
Right. But then I ended up finding it in the end.
So minimizing entities is not a virtue all on its own, right? So suppose I say, well, here's the most virtuous theory. There isn't anything at all. Look, I've minimized the entities down to zero. That's a terrible theory, right?
Right.
So what the principle is that you look for managing this trade-off between minimizing your entities and maximizing explanation, right? And it's very important that that's what you're doing. So this is a version of, really, it's a kind of more sophisticated version of Occam's razor, right? Don't postulate entities beyond necessity, right? You have to postulate enough entities so that you can explain as much as possible, right?
Right.
Roughly.
Right.
I mean, that's not quite right. There's a kind of sweet spot between because you might.
And I'm on the same page with you. I agree completely. I'm just putting myself in Daniel's shoes, who's asking, why should we do that? Why do we think that should lead to truth and not truth?
Given the important caveat there is, and Graham kind of explained it, is given naturalism. Now, I, in principle, would totally agree with trying to find that sweet spot. I think that makes logical sense. I think it's a fine way of analyzing things. But as Sean pointed out, you could have a multiplicity of entities, and you could have a really bad theory, and it could still be true. But my question was couched in the bigger picture of, given naturalism is true, does it necessarily follow the methodology that Graham is adopting? Does that necessarily follow from naturalism as he believes it? That was my bigger question. But yes, thank you, Ken. That was pretty accurate of you to steel man my position. Thank you.
But I think for me, if I were to try to encapsulate, well, my worry about all this is like, I agree with that principle, but I struggle to explain why that should be the case. What undergirds that principle?
Right.
And all I can think of is, from a pragmatic perspective, that usually when we apply that principle, we end up discovering what we all universally agree to be true, like heliocentrism, for example. But that's just a pragmatic argument. I don't have a philosophical argument for why that should be true.
Okay, so let's talk about the dispute between Copernicus and the Ptolemaic ancestor, right? Because it kind of nicely illustrates the point. So Ptolemy had this theory where the Earth is stationary at the center and there are planets orbiting, and eventually there's a sphere of the fixed stars orbiting. And observation showed that you couldn't just have a sphere you needed to have some extra, and they wanted everything to be done in terms of circles. So you had to have what were called epicycles. You had to add these little extra kind of circular oscillations in order to get the theory to fit the data. Copernicus had a theory in which the sun was at the center, but otherwise it was just the same theory as Ptolemy's, and it had just as many epicycles in it as Ptolemy's theory did in order to get it to fit the data. In fact, for about a century, because of problems with his data, Copernicus's theory didn't fit the data as well as Ptolemy's did. But in principle, they're going to fit the data equally well, because we can just keep adding more epicycles. So the choice between the two theories was not in terms of their fit to the data. It was actually in terms of theoretical simplicity. There's a couple of ad hoc hypotheses that you need for Ptolemy's theory that you don't need for Copernicus's. The most obvious one is this. Venus and Mercury are always observed in the same part of the sky as the sun. Why would that be, right? If the Earth's at the center and Mercury and Venus and the sun are all just going around, surely it's going to end up a lot of the time that Mercury and Venus are on the opposite side of the Earth from the sun, and that never happens. So what Ptolemy postulated was that there was this epicycle for those planets that was centered on a line between the Earth and the sun, right? So that you could never, you know, the center of the orbit was there. So not the center of the orbit, but the center of the epicycle, so that it was guaranteed that you'd see Mercury and Venus in the same part of the sky. On the Copernican theory, it just falls out of the geometry of the theory that Mercury and Venus can't be far from the sun, because they're orbiting the sun, but on orbits that are much closer to the sun than the Earth. So if you just think about the geometry, you can't ever, they never, from the perspective of the Earth, they're always close to the sun. And so instead of having this extra theoretical hypothesis, the Copernican theory dispenses with it. So the Copernican theory is simpler, right? Because it's not just simplicity of entities, it's simplicity of posits as well, right? And there's another thing I won't explain about opposition for planets like Mars as well, and retrogression. There were a couple of reasons why the Copernican theory won out, and they were because of considerations about simplicity and the number of posits.
What's interesting, Graham, and in addition to that, you probably are familiar with Tycho Brahe's sort of midway between heliocentrism and geocentrism with epicycles. He did all the mathematical calculations, and then Kepler came along and calculated them all. But he actually held, and it's not widely known, I'm not even sure of the mechanical details of it, and I'm not sure if you know how theoretically simpler it was or if it was more complicated, but he actually believed that in a geocentric, I forgot what it was, but he had a combination of two of them.
Yes, he did. He had the sun going around the Earth, but
That's
Mercury
right,
and
yeah.
Venus going around the sun.
Yeah.
And indeed, that has the virtue of
It does.
keeping
Yeah.
them right. So
Right.
So I forget whether that will fit with the the other problem about retrogression. I don't think he solves it. I don't think he does. I don't think he solves that one. But yes, his theory in that respect was better than the Ptolemaic theory.
It
Right?
was.
It had the
Mhm.
virtue of Copernicus's theory.
Right.
Yeah.
But it speaks
Yes.
to your point in some sense when we're looking at cosmology. Even today, I think you bring forward with a Big Bang standard model, you have dark matter, dark energy, the expansion rate of space-time, that it's space-time itself is the further away it is, the faster it's going. And in fact, it's breaking the speed of light, not the galaxies, but the space-time fabric itself. So what's causing the expansion? What's holding galaxies together? And now that James Webb has found galaxies in the deepest part of the galaxy, where the universe, where there should only be star formation, but there's these mature galaxies. So now it seems like we're retrograding, if you will, back to the kind of explanatory. Are we approaching a point where the explanatory virtue of modern cosmology is in need of some fixing? Maybe, perhaps. It sounds like it. But thank you for all of that. Ken, did you have a follow-up, or were you satisfied with that, or you want to follow up with anything?
I'm good. I'll let the other Ken go out now, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. Dark mattergy. I just made that up on the spot.
I think it should stick.
Dark mattergy. Hey, we're going to be looking for dark mattergy particles here soon.
That'd be a good band name.
The dark mattergy. Yeah, that'd be absolutely fantastic. We'll follow up. We're about ready to wrap up here. James, I want to give you the floor. You are in charge. Graham, just to let you know, I don't know if you can join us or not, but your sparring partner on YouTube and all things philosophical that you've talked to in the last couple of years, I guess, Josh Rasmussen, he's going to be on with us next month. And James is here to tell us about that. If you want to join us in June, I don't know if it'll fit your schedule, but that's coming up for our next book club. James, take it away.
Well, before I get more into what's coming up that's the 1st, isn't it? June 1st?
Yes, June 1st, right. Oppy's June
Well,
2nd. Graham's June 2nd.
It'd be your June 2nd. Yes, we've got those
Mhm.
days fixed now. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, Dr. Oppy, for being
Yes,
with us, being our
thank you.
guest for a second time, and very, very enlightening and challenging for the Christians in the room, I'm sure, and but very informative. And I really, really appreciate your attitude and your clarity. And thanks so much for being part of the book club. Before I announce next month and get some more specifics, Graham, do you have any kind of advice or a word of encouragement for the atheists and for the Christians? Anything to share with us as a motivation or encouragement?
So, I mean, what I've published isn't really, on the whole, is kind of neutral between the positions, really. I mean, I've advocated for a particular way of thinking about how, if you really want to try and assess them, how you should do it. But I also have pointed out that it's kind of impossible, really, to carry out the procedure, and it's highly unlikely that I think that we will ever have something like a decisive way of deciding between a whole range of worldviews that we've got. And that may be discouraging to some people on both sides, but should be encouraging to other people.
Agreed on that. It's and we've had long talks too about how our presuppositions and our biases that we all, part of being in our book club, I think, is trying to acknowledge that and try to overcome that, as well as being able to look at, as you put well in the book, the best arguments. I want to hear the best. I'm a Christian, but I'd like to hear the best atheist arguments. And you certainly did a good job of being fair and giving us some very good arguments. So I did want to talk about, let me see if I can put this up on the screen for us here.
And Graham, too, while he's doing that, I just want to thank you, too. I think this book in particular, and the way you did it, we've been doing this for 5-6 years. I've been reading a lot of atheist literature. I think yours is one of the most epistemically humble and civil approaches to the theism-atheism debate. And it makes it fun to read it because you don't have a sort of a Dawkins-esque kind of bark to it. So I appreciate that. I really did. I enjoyed reading your book.
Thank you.
Well, we are going to be looking next month at Joshua Rasmussen. Let me see if I can get that to switch. There we go. And Joshua has a PhD. He's assistant professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific. His area of expertise is analytic metaphysics with a focus on basic categories of reality, such as objects, ideas, and necessary existence. He has published more than a dozen articles on these topics in peer-reviewed academic journals, as well as a scholarly book, Defending the Correspondence Theory of Truth, Cambridge Press in 2014. But on June 1st, we're going to be talking about his 2019 book, How Reason Can Lead to God. And I think we'll probably pick up on some of the same discussion that we had in this book club, which ended up being kind of a continuation of our last month's, some of the things we were talking about, especially with Bill, talking about the fine-tuning argument that bled over in this book club. So that's going to be our next book, How Reason Can Lead to God. And so I want to encourage you to be part of that. Let me say thank you to all of our club members. You've been gracious, had good questions, good comments. And we look forward to seeing you on June 1st. That'll come quickly now. So we don't have a full month this time. So on our website, atheistchristianbookclub.com, we will have links to the book, as well as as we usually try to do, we will have either some focused chapters in the book or we will have a YouTube video or two for those that don't have time to finish the book. You can watch that and kind of get a general idea of what's going to be talked about and be a better participant. Thank you so much. And until June 1st, have a great couple of days, couple of weeks. Thank you.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I noticed in the chat the question about the reading the cover backwards from top to bottom by accident. Right. So I had quite a lot of input into that book. Josh sent me all of the chapters, and I sent him back feedback on it. I think I didn't get to see the cover, and I find the cover quite confusing. It would have been better if it hadn't been printed the way it was.
As it turns out, I was just looking on Amazon, and the cover shows the opposite. It shows how reason can lead to God from the top to bottom. So,
mine's upside down. Mine's how reason can lead to God from the bottom up. That's funny.
Yeah.
That's really funny.
It's almost like a marketing. They were trying to figure out which one to do, and they just released both of them. Maybe.
Graham, how many videos have you done with Josh? How many exchanges have you had?
A couple. So most recently with Joe Schmidt, we talked about ontological arguments, because Josh and I and Joe are doing the new Stanford Encyclopedia entry on ontological arguments. Before it was just mine, and I thought it'd be nice to bring some other people with different points of view in on it. And so we were talking about that. Maybe 3-4 times I've talked with Josh. He's great. I do like that book. It's a really good book.
Excellent.
Great. And we will try to pull up a video or two of you guys in dialogue. So that'll be a great continuation from this month into our June 1st book club. Again, Graham, thank you so much for being part of our club. And I hope we can have you back in a future conversation as well.
Cheers.
Can I ask Mr. Oppy a quick question, please?
Yes, who's that?
That's me, Ken. I had comments, but I never got a chance to speak it. So I have a quick.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes. So go ahead and do a quick question to be good.
Is he gone? Is he gone?
No, he's here.
No, I'm still here.
I don't know what happened. My screen all of a sudden went haywire. I have a question. Regarding the simpler theory being the better theory. Okay. Now, I'm not an educated man. Oh, here we go. I'm not an educated person. So I do know about F equals ma and Newton's formula, F equals gm1 m2 over r squared. That simple thing, right? I understand that, and I can work with it. But when it comes to Einstein's theory, which is more correct, it's so complicated that probably how many people in the world can work with it? So not the simpler one is not necessarily, or is it always necessarily the best? You see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
I'm sorry I'm rushing because I know there is no time.
Yeah. So I tried to argue earlier that Einstein's theory is simpler than Newton's in the kind of relevant sense. It's not straightforward. The kind of complexity of the mathematics is irrelevant, right, to the simplicity or complexity of the theory.
But simpler for who? You may be a scientist like Heisinger, whatever, and understand all that. But I do not understand that. It's not simple for me.
I think simplicity is the concept of simplicity is different than what you might be thinking, Ken.
That's what I'm trying to say. How do we define simplicity and complexity?
So there are 3 aspects of the simplicity of a theory. One is how many different kinds of entities and maybe how many entities it commits to. One has to do with how many primitive terms you need in order to express the theory. And the third one is in terms of the primitive claims that you have to commit to in the theory. So the last one would be spelled out in terms of axiomatization, at least in principle. So, which theory's got the simpler axiomatization. The middle one is sort of how many undefined terms do you need in order to state the theory? And then the first one is the thing that is closer to the thing maybe that you were thinking of, but it's not exactly it. How many different kinds of things do you have to postulate? How many things? Maybe it's better, all else considered, if you suppose the world's finite than if you think it's infinite, for example. Maybe that just counts as a kind of simplicity. I kind of have an open mind about that. I have an open mind about lots of things, but yeah.
Thanks, Ken.
Simple can mean different things. There's a parallel in theology that you have the 4 Gospels. John has the most complex theology, difficult to wrap your head around of certainly the 4 Gospels, if not the whole New Testament. but it's actually written in the simplest Greek, the simplest vocabulary, the simplest grammar. So you start learning Greek by translating John or First John, although the theology is very, very complex. So I don't think Graham was meaning that everybody can understand theory of special relativity or theory of relativity, but that doesn't mean that the principle itself is not a very simple mathematical structure. Is
That's a
that fair
good
to say?
analogy. Good analogy.
I understand that. I mean, I understand, but I was trying to say that perhaps we need to define what we mean by simplicity. And
Oh yeah, sure. Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
had something else to say. I wanted to answer Phil, but he's gone, unfortunately.
Yeah,
But-
we're out of time too, Ken. We've got to wrap up and Graham's got to go. So
All right.
thanks, guys.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you.